It's a pretty brutal charge, isn't it, James Wilde, that the previous governments, Conservatives, the last 14 years, didn't invest enough for the economy today. Would you agree with that?
Well, in the last Parliament, actually, we did increase capital investment significantly, close to what this government is going to do. But what the spending review is going to do today, it's going to lock in the higher borrowing, the higher spending and the £40 billion a year of higher taxes paid for by businesses and by my constituents and your viewers. And as sure as night follows day, there's going to be higher taxes coming in the autumn budget again this year, and the economic indicators are going in the wrong way because the government's lost control of the finances.
We've got the fastest growth in the G7
You had that when you won the election, and you had inflation at 2%, it's now at 3.5%. And they borrowed £151 billion last year. That was 70% higher than the plans they inherited from Conservatives. Over the course of this Parliament, the amount that's spent on debt interest, paying for our debt, is going to go up by an extra £70 billion because of Rachel Reeves's decisions. We spend £50 billion a year on our defence budget. So we need to get the economy growing, but putting up businesses, taxes on businesses and on working people is not the way to do it. And that's what Rachel Reeves has unfortunately done. And we've seen it with the unemployment figures yesterday, 100,000 fewer people on payroll. That's a result of her decisions.
So what would Conservatives do instead?
Well, we wouldn't have taken the decisions that they did. We would be driving better value for money in our public services. It's good to put more money into the NHS. We did that. But you've got to get productivity gains. And my constituents, your viewers, want to know what's happening with my waiting list. When can I see my GP? Can I see an NHS dentist? That's what they should be judged by, not just big announcements of big amounts of money, actually driving reform. Wed Streeting talk's a good game. We haven't seen the results yet.
But look, this is the challenge, is that the Conservatives over and again say they support the increase in spending that we put into the NHS, an extra 20 billion or more, which we were able to fund through tax rises because we didn't
junior doctors, and you got nothing in response, and they're about to go on strike again as a result of your 20%.
Just on the pay rises, the Conservative government said that they would meet the recommendations of the independent review, but didn't leave any money aside for it. We had to close that gap. We've invested in our public services, and we've said how we're going to pay for it. The problem with the Conservative, you can see they haven't learned from what happened under Liz Truss, where they had all these spending commitments and all these tax cuts, and the bond markets didn't like that, and it pushed up interest rates for people in my constituency and the people across the country. I would respect the opposition more if they said, we don't support those tax rises, and we're going to take this 40 billion out of the NHS or out of defence or out of health or out of a different public service. But you're just not willing to do that. You want to have your cake and eat it.
Your jobs tax, which is seeing more people not getting jobs, people being laid off, unemployment going up as a result of your choices.
Let's bring in paper for
spending review. What do the Conservatives make of it? James Wilde, the Shadow Treasury Minister, is with me now. James, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. What did you make of what Rachel Reeves had to say?
Hi, Dominic. Well, I think in amongst the flurry of announcements, what this essentially did was it locked in the plans for the higher spending, higher borrowing, and of course the 40 billion of tax rises that were imposed at the last budget. And it makes it pretty nailed on that she's going to have to come back with higher tax raises in the autumn as well in order to fund these plans. And that's going to cause the damaging uncertainty we saw after the autumn budget. We're already seeing businesses holding off investment because they're not sure about the economic outlook, and the data we had earlier this week in terms of unemployment increasing with inflation above target level. None of that is helping to invest into our economy. So there was a lot about how Rachel Reeves was going to spend taxpayers' money. She didn't refer to taxpayers' money once, I don't think, in her contribution. I was just scanning the document to look at the efficiency section, and that includes hiring another 7,900 officials in order to collect tax. So we're not quite seeing the commitments lived up to that were kind of made about being a more efficient government.
I mean, to be fair to this government, one of the reasons that they have a bit of a problem with the public finances is that the previous government, the Conservatives, left debt at about 100% of GDP.
Yeah, and what's happening now, due to Rachel Reeves's plan, she's going to be spending an extra £80 billion of taxpayers' money just paying for the interest on the additional debt that she's taking on over the course of this Parliament. And of course, the deficit last year was £151 billion.
No, that's not correct at all. The government spends about £100 billion a year on debt already. Most of that debt was built up when the Labour arrived.
No, due to the additional debt that through changing the fiscal rules, she's going to have to pay more debt interest and rolled up over the period of the Parliament. That's the figure that's come out. And in terms of the deficit, it was £151 billion last year, which, as the Shadow Chancellor pointed out, was 70% higher than the plans that she inherited from the Conservatives. So what we've seen is a big splurge today, and what I think families at home will be worried about, people who are working hard to make their ends meet, is that they're going to see probably more tax rises coming in September to help pay for this splurge of borrowing and spending across the economy.
Well, I do return to the point that debt was 100% of GDP when
we
she
did
arrived.
have COVID, obviously. We spent 400 billion. I accept it was very high, but what the Chancellor's chosen to do is to increase it. She inherited high taxes, and she's choosing to increase them further. So that's making us less competitive.
So she was meant to fill in the hole you left?
No, but she's chosen to change the fiscal rules to borrow a lot more money. We would not have done that. And she said before the election she wouldn't do that. Of course, Dominic, if you recall.
Just to move on, in listening to it, I thought she talked about more money for the NHS, more money for housing, more money for defence. To me, it sounded very much like spending reviews we've had in the past from Conservative chancellors.
Yeah, absolutely. We've put a lot more money into the NHS, and we support additional spending on defence. I think where people are looking for more is in terms of the value that we're getting for that money. Obviously, a huge amount of money was put into the NHS in the autumn budget. Have we seen the results in terms of appointments, in terms of people? She didn't mention NHS dentists. That's one of the biggest issues that any MP will tell you their constituents are concerned about. My constituents still can't get to see NHS dentists. So putting more money in is not simply the answer. You also need to drive the productivity. And of course, we saw when they came in, they gave junior doctors a 20% plus pay increase to end the strikes. And what do we have now? The doctors looking to go on strike again because they want another 20%. So she hasn't proved herself to be tough enough, and it should be about value for money and delivering for the British people rather than just announcing the inputs. We've had far too much of that across governments in the past.
Just in 30 seconds, James, what would the Conservatives do differently? What wouldn't you spend on to avoid future tax rises if they come?
Well, we set out plans before the election to save £12 billion in welfare spending. We had big plans to drive up NHS productivity, would have generated significant savings to be reinvested. And we would be not imposing huge taxes on businesses, which are leading to unemployment and to see growth depressed and downgraded by the OBR. We would have made very different choices.
Thank you very much, James Wild, the Shadow Treasury Minister. Thank you very much for your company this afternoon. We've been talking about Rachel Reeves' spending review, of course.
The number to call. Let's speak to James Wild now, who is Shadow Treasury Minister and Conservative MP for North West Norfolk. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, hi.
Do you really think, do the Conservatives really think, as Mel Stride said straight after Rachel Reeves sat down, that she's planning cruelly to raise taxes or announce that she's going to raise taxes in the autumn?
Well, I think the reality is she hasn't left herself much option. She has baked in the higher spending, the higher borrowing and the higher taxes from the autumn, which added £40 billion a year in taxes onto businesses and to families. And now she's left very little space for external shocks. If growth doesn't pick up, then she's going to find a gap like she did in March when she had to come forward with those welfare cuts, which even now Labour MPs are lobbying to have scrapped, which were worth, I think, £3 or £4 billion. So that's putting more pressure on her. So it's almost certainly going to have to come back with higher taxes because she's decided to max out on her plans.
So what would you have done instead?
Well, we would have made different choices. We wouldn't have imposed £25 billion of jobs tax onto our small and larger businesses. We would have pursued proper welfare reform. At the election, we had £12 billion of savings that we were looking to introduce, as Mel Stride said in Parliament. That would have reduced the number of people claiming health and sickness benefits by 450,000 over the Parliament. So they were meaningful changes. We also would have driven up productivity in the public sector. There wasn't much talk of that. What we heard a lot of was spending and commitments to spend billions of pounds. But people want to get, your listeners want to have better value for money. They want to support the NHS, but they want to be able to see a doctor. They want to be able to get their appointment. And they also want to be able to see a dentist, which is a big issue across the country. And the Chancellor didn't even mention that when she was talking about health spending. So I think getting better value for money as well, but lifting the foot off the throat of business so that the economy can grow. The government came in rightly talking about growth, and unfortunately the actions it's taken has seen growth downgraded as forecast. Clearly some of the investments announced today in terms of capital will help support growth, and we support those. But as you say, the devil's in the detail for much of it, and unfortunately the Chancellor hasn't really learned her lesson from October when she left herself so little headroom. She had to make rush changes in March.
We'll come back to the NHS in a second, but there's a lot of people getting in touch with us saying that the Conservatives shouldn't really be standing on a slightly wobbly leg of going on about tax when under the Conservatives the the amount of tax that was being taken from people was at record levels.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair, and I get why people are saying that, and they said that at the election, and they gave their verdict on our economic approach then. I simply point out that obviously we did spend £400 billion on support during COVID, which benefited people across the country, and £100 billion on energy bills. So we did put up the tax burden higher than we'd want. But the reality now is the Chancellor's putting up even higher. It's going to get to the highest levels since World War II very soon. So she could have taken a decision to ease the burden.
Of course, but you know why she says she did that, because of the £22 billion black hole that you guys left.
Yeah, I think this gets a bit silly, though, because the OBR have said there wasn't a £22 billion black hole, and she said she had to do winter fuel cuts to restore stability, to avoid a run on the pounds. Then they get smashed in the local elections, and then suddenly they can afford to do it. So I think people should judge them by their actions rather than by their words. I get why politically they wanted to claim there was this black hole, but there wasn't. There was in-year pressures that you get every year as you run a massive budget, spending hundreds of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. And I don't think there was enough thought about the taxpayer and value for money in what she's announced today.
I want to talk with you lastly about the NHS. So the Chancellor is announcing an extra £29 billion a year is going to be spent on the NHS. It's an annual rise of 3% on current levels. Do you support that?
Well, we supported putting higher funds into the NHS when we were in government. We'll look at the detail of this. I don't know how much of that might be allocated to paying off the junior doctors again. They used 22% pay rises last time. So what people want to see, what my constituents want to see, is delivery for that additional money, and we haven't had the productivity gains that we need to see, the better value for money. So we'll have a look at the detail of that. We'll look at the detail of all the pledges in here. Clearly that decision has knock-on effects for protecting our border and other parts of the spending envelope as well. So we have to look at all of these things in a round, which we will do.
OK, James Wild, thank you very much. He's Shadow Treasury Minister and Conservative MP for North West Norfolk.